You're here today. So I'm Heidi Carter from the California ISO. I'm one of the trainers in our customer readiness group. And so we focus not just on training, but also on making sure that our customers are ready to perform the roles that they need to within their within the markets, within the ISO as a whole. Because we have a lot of different ways that people can participate. But we're here to talk about the market, and I'll be starting with the Western Energy Imbalance Market, or WEIM. So what is our agenda for this part? I'm going to be kicking us off, as it was mentioned that we're going to be going through a couple different presentations. Mine is really setting that foundation for the market. So talking about Western Imbalance Energy, Western Energy Imbalance Market, getting that kind of foundation set about not just the market, but why it's important, what we're doing, with it, and how it relates to reliability. But I'm really setting that foundation. Then Radha's going to come up, talk about the day ahead market. So I might be talking about some things, giving you some advance notice of saying, all right, there are important pieces that feed into the real-time market, but Radha will be taking you through some of the more details. So I'll point that out to you so you know when there'll be more information provided later. So that's getting you a foundation of what we're doing now with the Western Energy Imbalance Market, what's happening now with the day ahead market. And then that's going to feed into Phil and Milos talking about the extended day ahead market, that big project that we are working on right now with our stakeholders to do exactly what it says, extend that day ahead market that we currently offer out to a larger region. So in my part of it here, we're going to be talking about the WEIM concepts. So what are some of the basics? I'm, being here with a new audience, not sure exactly what everybody's level is. We tried to kind of bring it down to a level that is, conversational, that is hopefully, clear. Some of you might have more knowledge, some of you less. So, please speak up during this presentation. Feel free to ask questions. If it goes a little deep or a little bit off, more out of scope for what we're talking about now, we'll be capturing that information and we'll follow up, might have a different discussion, or it might be covered in later presentations. So I'll point you to that, but we'll have kind of a parking lot, if you will, for anything that is kind of outside of the scope of what we're talking about this morning. We'll talk about real-time market inputs. So what is going into the market, and then what are the processes that are happening with all those inputs, and then the processes that are the outcomes. What are the outputs from those processes? And then, as we said before, the support resources. So that's just a very high level to let you know, what the ISO offers to the folks that are actually participating in our markets. A little disclaimer about the information so that you'll see that on your slides. So let's get into it. Let's review the basics. So we're going to talk about the markets, but let's back up just a little bit, because some people might be like, what's balance versus imbalance? What does that even mean? So we take it back to what is the whole purpose of the electric industry, and what are the actions that are being taken? It's all about, providing that balance. So within the energy industry, that's really what's happening. We're trying to balance demand versus supply. And what does that mean? Some of you might already know, some of you might be still like, okay, I'm putting these things together. Demand is also known as load. That would be us, the consumers, the lights on in this building, plugging in your cars if you have electric cars. It's running your house, hospitals, you name it, all the different resources wherever we turn on the lights. That's the demand, and we need to figure out where that, how much that demand's going to be, and we do that through load forecasts. We get that information, and then there's the supply. That's the generation. That's the solar. That's the wind. That's the gas facilities. That is batteries now. So that's growing at this point, and so batteries are now being used to supply some of that energy, to store it and produce it, and use it, especially for the renewables, because energy needs to be consumed as soon as it's produced. So you can't just say, I'm going to hold on to it a little bit later. But now with batteries, we're able to do that and start capitalizing on that. But it takes a whole mix of these different resources in order to meet that supply and demand, to keep that balance. And we try to do that. You can see that little, 60 hertz up there. So that's the North American standard of how the equipment cycles. So energy, when it's being produced, it's got to be cycling, all this equipment cycling at 60 hertz. Kind of like if you were to put you're driving along, you put your car on cruise control at 60 miles per hour. You want to keep that at 60 miles per hour. And we have tools, we have regulators that will keep us going, keep all the equipment cycling at that particular speed so that we don't have that damage. So these are things that are being monitored, and we need to make sure that we keep this equipment protected, that we are able to keep it flowing so that we can keep that balance. When we talk about balance, it's like, what are we balancing? We talked about this demand and the supply. Really, it's making sure that we have the energy that can flow. So that's what's actually being used. That's what's being consumed. It's the energy that's being produced, that's being flowed over the transmission lines to our houses, or down to the distribution to our houses. But we also have reserves. And when we start talking about the Western energy imbalance market, it's like we're a market only, but you still have to think about those reserves. How much extra do you need in case there's an outage, in case there's some kind of a problem? You have to have enough that you can backfill if there's a shortage of energy. So it's because it is all about that reliability. So we have operators, we have engineers, we have systems that are all looking at this data months, years in advance, and then down to the real time, what's happening right at this moment. So it takes all of these pieces to really come together to maintain this balance. And who's doing this? So this is what we're trying to do, but who's doing this? Now we start talking about balancing authorities. So the ISO is a balancing authority, but within WEC, within our Western interconnection, there are about 38, 39 different balancing authorities that you see up there kind of by this not to scale representation of the Western interconnection. You see the different areas. So these balancing authorities, they are maintaining balance within their areas. And part of that is making sure that they're reliably planning and operating their high voltage grid. So that is, again, making sure that they're keeping that balance within their own area. So each one of these is making sure they're maintaining that balance. They're also meeting import and export obligations. So what does that mean? That means, again, they're looking maybe years in advance, maybe they have contracts down to the day before to share that energy between the different balancing authority areas at these interconnection points. And so that all has to be scheduled. So if those are, if they do have that and they've made those plans, they've made those contracts, then they need to flow that energy. So they've got to maintain those obligations to make sure that they're exporting the energy that they need to, or importing it to make sure that they're meeting those obligations. So this is something that, regardless of the market, they're doing right at this particular moment. And then adhering to the federal and industry regulations. So when we start talking about the 60 hertz, when we start talking about standards that they have to operate up to, again, all the entities, all these BAAs, they have standards, federal and regulatory standards that they have to meet. And so they've got to adhere to those, make sure that they're not having any kind of violations within their own area. So that is something they're doing now. It's something they've been doing, and they'll continue to do. So balancing authority area is responsible for that. One of the things that we offer to help with this is that because the ISO is a balancing authority. We are also registered as the reliability coordinator. We're also registered as load serving entity. We're registered in quite a few different ways, grid operator, but we're also registered as a market operator. So we're providing a market for the area, and we've already had it in our own area. So maybe some of you may have heard about, almost a couple decades ago now, starting the MRTU, the market redesign. So we've got our markets. And when I first started in the industry, you had markets over here, and then you had reliability, keeping that balance going. But as we've moved further, as technologies have advanced, we're starting to see how the market really does help with that reliability. It makes sure that we've got the supply that we need to serve that demand. We have two markets that actually help with this. We have the day ahead and the real time. So like I said, Rod is going to be covering the day ahead, so I'm not going to cover this at this particular time, but we also have the real-time market. So in this market, as you can see here, we're economically dispatching energy in real time. So we're keeping that balance through those dispatches to make sure that our supply is meeting that demand. So we do that, making sure that the system's reliable. We're looking for things such as congestion. Is there too much load on a line, or is there a resource that's no longer available? And so these things are being looked at so we make sure that we have the balance that we need. Our real-time market also extends outside of California. Now, when it was first there, we had it for our California Balancing Authority area. But with the WEIM, we've extended that beyond our border to all the different Western states. We also have hour ahead scheduling for those intertie points. So, mentioned that there were those intertie points that we had between the different areas. That's part of the market, taking into account hourly what is actually being scheduled to be flowing across those intertie points through the different areas. And then we have an optimization that's happening. You're going to hear optimization quite a few times. That's basically where our market's taking all the data and deciding, crunching all of that, deciding what is the best outcome. We do this for an hourly, but we also do this for every 15 minutes. We started that a few years back to account for our variable energy resources. So the wind, the solar, those things that are not just, you can turn on, you can run it in the middle of the night or not, things that rely on the environment in order to produce that energy that aren't quite as stable, but also have a lot of changes. Because a cloud cover can seriously change how much solar is output. And it can happen for seconds, moments, minutes, and then all of a sudden, you have a lot more megawatts that are available. So by realizing that you've got a market, you've got the plans, but things change, we have this in the real-time market to account for that, to really look at what are the system conditions so that the optimization is the most efficient, most effective. And we do that so that we can meet in the 5-minute that instantaneous demand. So an important thing to note about the real-time market and WEIM is that we did not create a new market for WEIM. We already had that, our market, our real-time market, and it's just, we're utilizing that foundation. We've really just extended it. And we're doing that really with the day-ahead market. When Phil and Milos start talking about it, it's what we're doing as well. We're capitalizing on a market that we've already created, and we're extending that to a larger region. So WEIM, it has a few different differences in settlements, in some of the rules, some of the tools that are used. But for the most part, we're using that foundation of our real-time market for WEIM. So we just mentioned what a balancing authority and what those are. What is the difference between those BAs that are participating in WEIM and those that are not? So some of you may have seen something similar to this if you've looked into WEIM. if if the states are not, or the balancing authority areas, if they're not in a market, each organization, each area is responsible for balancing their own load inside of their own area. So regardless of any other states, they have to look at, what is my demand inside of my area? What is my supply that I have to meet that? They're going to have to make sure that they're, giving that information over to NERC, making sure that they're hitting those regulatory guidelines. And they need to make sure that they have adequate capacity in their area, so that if one of their resources or some of their resources go down, that they can still support that load. So that's not even a change with the WEIM. What does make it different is that now you've got more resources that are available. So within a Western energy imbalance market, you're basically playing in a bigger pool. At this point, you've got different resources that are maybe more reliable. Maybe they're ready, they're able to produce the energy a little sooner. Maybe they're cheaper, maybe they're more environmentally friendly. So there's a lot of different characteristics of different types of resources that are available. And you can start sharing that energy. So as far as capacity, because of those federal and regulatory requirements, with capacity, you have to have a certain amount. But now when you've got a larger pool to play with, you don't have to have as much reserve, because you're using that energy imbalance market. Because people now are also, they're generating that energy within their own area. They're already producing it. But let's say they've got a resource that can produce 10 megawatts, but they only need 5 for the load inside of their area. They can now sell that off as imbalance into the WEIM. And now that's new resources. That's a bigger pool that they can make money off of, because they would have been running that anyway. But now, instead of wasting that energy, they can actually supply it to others. And again, you've got more of that, more resources available for any kind of contingencies as well. But we do make sure that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, make sure that each one of these balancing authority areas are still maintaining the most important thing, that they're running their own area and they're not leaning on their neighbors. So, they're still in control of what resources are they actually want to provide into the market, how much they want to provide into the market, but they're still responsible for all the different regulations that they have as a balancing authority that's not inside of WEIM. So before we get into that next, we're going to talk about the real-time processes. Any questions that anyone has at this point? Yes, go ahead. Intertie resources, those are the ones that are used to, that's where you're going to be sharing that information, those resources between the different balancing authority areas. So, oh, go ahead, yes. You still have to have that target, and I think it's I want to say it's 6%, or yeah. I was like, it's 3 and 3, but I can't remember how it's broken down. But it's like you still have to have that 6% target of capacity reserves within your own area. So WEIM doesn't actually look at what are the resources that you're using for capacity in there, because it's an energy only market. But the capacity, still has to be, those are still procured by each balancing authority. They've got to make sure that they're hitting those targets. Did you want to add something, Phil?
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Phil Pettengill. The numbers Heidi was trying to refer to is 6% overall, but the way the NERC standards work, it's based on 3% of load and 3% of gen to get to that 6%. So in some cases, it's not necessarily exactly 6% of load or gen, because it's 3 and 3. I think it's also important to know that in EIM, as Heidi's been mentioning, the balancing areas still retain all of their reliability obligations under the NERC standards. So to your question, it's really beyond just those contingency reserves. It's all of those responsibilities. And that's why the question earlier about having, interties and what's the importance of interties is another thing I wanted to expand on that Heidi was mentioning is, when we're looking at the load within a particular balancing area and how to serve that load, load could also be exports that they've committed to. And similarly, it can happen on the flip side of that equation, back to the intertie resource question. Intertie resources could be a resource that a balancing area is relying upon to help serve its load. So interties and these transfers are going to be really important when we get to the conversation that Milos and I are going to share with you on conversations we're having with stakeholders in EDAM, because this intertie transactions is a very big part of how energy moves across the Western interconnection.
That's a good lead in for your class later. So it's like, any other questions at this point? All right. All right. So as I mentioned, we have a day ahead and a real-time market. So this is just a high level diagram kind of giving you the idea of what the processes look like and how the day ahead actually feeds into our real-time market. So Radha again is going to take you through the day ahead market part of this. That has, it's part of the schedule a day in advance, but those results then kind of kick off that real-time market. The real-time is happening for each hour, every day, 24/7. It's constantly being looked at. We're making sure that we're truing up for each hour as far as what energy and what capacity is going to be needed. And so we've got 75 minutes before each operating hour. There are some processes, there's information input that we're going to talk about here in a moment that go into the market so that those real-time market processes can happen. We can clear the market for the different time frames. Again, we're looking at the hourly interties, we're looking at the 15-minute and then the 5-minute. And then those dispatches are received for those resources. When it's dispatched, that means go. You were selected, this resources was selected for this amount, and you're going to actually flow and provide that energy. And then we'll go into post-market processes. So that's a high level, and we'll just kind of keep drilling down into what these processes look like. So we're going to get into the inputs, processes, and outputs. So from a high level, again, it's all about the data that's going in there, the resources that are available, and taking into account all the different characteristics, the availability to determine what's going to be optimized in the real-time market. So if we start with inputs, we have inputs that are coming from the real time. So again, we're making sure that we're getting all that information 75 minutes before each hour. We're looking at what's the grid and resource information. So what supply is available? What are the needs that we have? What is the state of the system right now? Is weather impacting it? Are there different outages, which you see up there, resource outages? Is there any kind of, are there any generators that maybe aren't available? Are there transmission lines that are not available that we have to consider? But we've got to take in all that data, all the characteristics of the different resources for this optimization. We have resource plans, which which include the energy bids for any participating resources, for anyone who's participating in the real-time market, as well as base schedules. And I'll explain what those are here in just a moment. Again, the resource outages, but also operator instructions. So I mentioned earlier, we've got the tools, we've got operating engineers that are putting in studies, data, doing power flows of what would this look like if we ran this particular optimization. But the operators are still monitoring the system. We still have those folks that are highly trained, that are monitoring what's going on in their particular area. For the ISO, we're looking over, our balancing authority area, but we also have the market that we're taking a look at. Then you've got the reliability coordinator that's looking over the Western interconnection. So there's a lot of situational awareness that's going on And so these folks are taking a look at that, and they can make those decisions going, hey, what's happening in my area that I might need to make adjustments for? So those are very important inputs, and they can make those adjustments in that real time to maintain that reliability. We also have day-ahead data that's going in there. So said Rod is going to cover what that is, but it is a factor because a day in advance that folks are putting in their bids, they're putting in their schedules, and they're locking in prices a day in advance. So that's really kind of, hedging, saying this is the price I want to get. Hopefully, it's better than the price in real time, because when we get to real time, these optimizations are going to look at those resources that were committed in the day ahead, and they're going to re-optimize, and it might change what you were awarded, what you were instructed to do the day before. It's going to make a decision, again, based on what does the system look like and what's available, and then make that best determination through the optimization. So those can change, and any kind of changes are going to end up in our settlements process. So that's where the adjustments are going to be made. But they're really locking in this plan, and that gives us an opportunity to know a day in advance what's going to be showing up, what can show up in real time. So again, it's for reliability. So that's looking at, again, grid resource information, what awards were given the day before. Were they meant to be flowing energy, or were they meant for capacity? Because there are different characteristics that will determine what they're going to be able to provide, and it could have to do with their bids, et cetera. So, but we're looking at that a day ahead, and those all go into this process that we have, and we have evaluations and we have optimization. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the processes, that we actually have an evaluation of what is available, what's been provided into the market for each hour, to assess, is this going to be, is this going to make sure that each one of those balancing authorities are able to still provide for their own load within their area. And then based on that, then the market optimization starts, and that's when the decisions are being made. That's when instructions are being given, and that's when dispatches are being made. And so that's part of the output. So we've got real-time dispatches. Those are the 5-minute dispatches. Those are, again, the instructions to say, this is what you've been selected for, and you've been selected, this is for how much, and this is what I want you to be supplying. So that's, what these instructions are coming out to these resources. We have tools that, that supply that to the resources. So, like I said, we've got a lot of different technologies that will actually send out those dispatches and get those units ready to provide that. And that's for each 5-minute interval for each hour. We also have the 15-minute market, and though we've got those results that are coming out, and that's again to make sure, we've got resource sufficiency instructions. We're telling the equipment to get into position where we're probably going to dispatch you. Again, we do a re-optimization for every hour. We do it for every 15-minute. We do it for every 5-minute. And so things could change. Even if you get the instructions, then we are still looking at what the system is, what is the forecast, what is the state of the grid right now that might still make some changes. So these optimizations are happening, but in the 15-minute, that's the instructions of start going where I need you to go, because not every resource can just turn on. You don't flip a switch and there it is. Some are very quick, like hydro, you can flow it and you're providing energy very quickly. Some others might take 24 hours to start up, depending on where they're at. So there's a lot of differences between the different resource types, the different generation. And it's something to be considered, that it's not, I know when I first started in the industry, I was like, yeah, I knew about turning on a light, and I'm like, that's energy, right? You just turn it on, you turn it off, and there it is. Till you get into it, you start thinking, this is very, very complicated because there's so many moving parts, and each generator has so many moving parts, and then you add that to the totality of all the different areas. There's a lot of data, a lot of information going in there. So that's where we're looking at, what are the best changes and how do we position these resources based on their capabilities Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Thanks. This is a pretty basic question, but I'm just curious, mostly because I've never visited your offices in Folsom. If I had visited, I'd probably know. What kind of workload goes into this? I mean, how many employees are doing this analysis and dispatch, making the dispatch decisions? Is it all in one big control room, or is it less centralized?
Oh, that's
Just to get an idea for physically how this functions.
Yeah, no, great question. So we have a control room. I should have put this in my presentation, a picture of our control room. But we have our shift supervisor that's looking over it. We have generation desks. So we've got folks that are looking over, operators that are looking at the generation. We have market operators that are assessing, and we just usually have one at a time, one person on shift for the market. We have transmission dispatchers that are taking a look at all that. We've got some operations engineers that are in the control room. And so our control room is here. You've got all those folks. We've got our map board. There's a lot of information coming in for situational awareness. And they're the ones that are really looking at, what is the grid doing right now? What is, what trends do I see? They're talking, communicating between themselves. The operations engineers maybe running power flow. Some of our technology can run the power flow studies as well, but they're there to be able to do some of those as well. Off to the side, we have the reliability coordinators. So they're in a separate room, but still, in that control room. So they're kind of set apart. They're looking at the entire system, and so they can kind of communicate, but they're still a little bit apart. Then we've got the rest of the company, so we've got different groups. So there's a whole big section where we've got the operations engineering, and we're looking at, we have transmission planners, we've got regulatory. So there's a whole big 3-story section that's pretty empty right now, but that's where all the business folks go. But I think we're at about a 600-person head count, and then consultants, so there's a lot of different things going on. We're in the customer service group, so we have client representatives that help our customers. We've got in our with customer readiness. We've also got a legal area over there. So there are a lot of people that are looking at not only what are the capabilities that we're have, but also are we filing tariff amendments correctly? Are our processes, are they meeting the needs? So we've got that department as well. So it's a lot of different folks, but as far as the operators, there are probably usually about 20 people in the control room at one time, between 15, 20. So.
That's what I was trying to remember, Heidi. And Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to ask, were you curious about just the market aspect that Heidi's been talking about? I mean, she's covered really the whole, what's happening on the floor, but I just wanted to zero in and maybe check with you what you were asking about. Yeah.
Bigger than what you're talking about here.
The grid.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
in terms of running the markets, like Heidi's saying, I don't think we actually have 20 people on a shift. But a way to think about it is we have 6 shifts. And so we can operate 24 hours a day. And in any one of those shifts is something less than 20. I want to say it's more like closer to 15 or so. If we add the 3 RC operators, then we might get to 18. But they're not market aspect. Of that 15 or so that are on the floor, I really think there's only about 4 or 5 of them that are market related. What they're really doing is they're administering the tools that Heidi's talking about, where folks will send in their schedules. For example, one is managing maybe the day ahead market to make sure those things are coming in and we can run the market at 10 a.m. We'll talk about that later with Radha. But in terms of the EIM, we're having to make sure that they're putting in any adjustment bids and so forth in the hourly process that we're using for the WEIM. So there's definitely a market operator for that and maybe a couple more. So it literally is 4, 5, 6 people that are administering the day ahead and real-time markets.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, only one RTMO, our real-time market operator, we only have one at a time. So that's why we have to put in a lot of communication tools to make sure we broadcast that out to the different entities right away, because that's, quite a few. Yes.
Yeah, I'm unclear on what's in the EIM market, what the actual resources are versus the dispatch side. In other words, it sounds like the EIM has resources in the market that can change every 5 minutes. They can go up or down. But it also sounds if you're actually doing dispatch, you're dispatching the entire market inside the EIM. I'm just confused on the two markets.
Let me go into this next one, and then I'm gonna, then maybe that will answer that question. And if not, we'll circle back to that and be able to answer that. Settlements is another output of that. That gets into our inputs and our resource plan. So this is where it might help you with looking at that. So a resource plan is what we use to balance the different areas. So when we look at the different resources within an area, a balancing area that chooses to participate in the WEIM, they've got resources within their own area that they can designate as participating resources or non-participating. And by non-participating, that means these are resources that we're just using to supply energy to meet our own load needs. The participating resources are those that they have designated, gone through all all the practices to say, this is something that I actually want to participate in the market. So they can choose to have that looked at and go through that optimization by saying, I've got this resource, I want to bid in this many megawatts. And they can do it either economically by putting in a price, or what we call a price taker by putting in a self-schedule, just saying, I have these extra megawatts, I'll take whatever price. And that's how they're determining what, now when we look at the optimization, which one of those resources are they putting in? So that's through their bids that they're indicating what's going to happen. Now we have a single footprint, a single optimization for everyone that's participating in the real time. So that optimization is looking at location, resources, capabilities, the load forecast. It's taking into account all of those different pieces of information. And then it's doing a market optimization to put those awards out. Does that help kind of, or do you need more clarity?
Specifically, like the Palo Verde Nuclear Station, is it a non-participating resource?
I'm not sure. I don't know if it's how it would be designated, but it would be one that we could look into that to see what it's designated as. But that entity, that balancing authority could make that determination. Like when they're going through the whole process to become a marketer in our WEIM, we look at all the different resources and they can designate that, or they can just say, we had it participating, now we don't want to, or we didn't designate it, and they can make a choice and go through the process. But it's each entity's, it's their own choice of what they want to have serving that. And they have the opportunity, let's say it's a participating resource, but they can have it act as a non-participating by saying, I'm just not going to bid on it right now. So it's still part of the resource plan. Maybe they need it for their own load within their areas. If they don't put a bid in, it's not going to be considered by the market for that optimization. So they still have that control based on, again, those operators are looking at their areas and figuring out what their needs are. So, their marketers, their operators can make those adjustments as needed in order to maintain the reliability within their own area. Because at the end of the day, that's what's most important. If an entity needs to, they can hop out of the market in order to keep their system afloat, to make sure that there are no issues there. Does that help? Any other questions? Yeah? No? But we can look into that one. So I'm going to, Rochelle, if you don't mind capturing that question, and then we'll go ahead and look that up for you and we'll find out.
Well, usually, our commission's type of questions are all about which market do we grab the efficiency for retail customers? I mean, that's just the bottom line we're always focused on.
Mhm.
And why that is, why is it that a utility that's not participating in a market is not that efficient? And because we don't really control whether the utilities are going to join, but nevertheless, we're going to find ways to grab the efficiencies if we understand them. That's
Right.
just the way it works.
Yeah, and the, again, that's where the benefits start coming out. When you start looking at the benefits to the different areas, a lot of that is because they're having that control of saying, again, I'm not going to need this. Maybe my load forecast is pretty low. By participating in there and putting in the bids, especially if they put in a self-schedule, because those are going to be taken first because it's like, we'll take it whatever price. And so that gives some efficiencies as well, because now the market's looking at what is the cheapest, but it's also looking at, the different resources. It's looking at environmental, trying to use the renewables. It's looking at all these different things. And that's really what the whole optimization is about, is to look at what is the most efficient, what is the most cost effective. And then that ends up with the results, of passing on those efficiencies to the customers, and then however it gets determined in their OATs, their operating transmission tariffs, open access transmission tariffs. So, yeah. Yes, go ahead. Things are going through the market. We don't own anything. So we don't own any transmission. We don't own any generation. So all of that is, we're kind of a clearinghouse, if you will. So, you've got the different resources that are there. Within California, there's us, we're a balancing authority area. And then you've got Bank, which is inside of California. You've got TID, which is inside of California. And LADWP, so there's some different, or not LADWP, but there are, a couple of others, but they don't, in order to actually just flow their own, they would have to become a balancing authority. So that's like, when I said Bank, that's SMUD, which is our Sacramento Municipal Utility District. They chose 12, 15 years ago that they wanted to be their own balancing authority. And so they had to go through all that process. That means they're adhering to all those NERC, but everything is scheduled, through us as far as the transmission. So we're acting as that clearinghouse for making sure that the transmission, there's open access to that there's market efficiencies for we act as the clearinghouse for the market. So does that help, or is that, Phil, you might have something you want to add, it looks like.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question to follow up on where you were going, Tom, on the nuclear facility. It's important to recognize that, again, like we've been saying, foundationally, each balancing area has these obligations. In the case of the question about California, what's really happening is California ISO only covers about 80% of the load in the state of California. So there are other balancing areas that are not part of the ISO's BA. So they would have the obligation to maintain and operate against those NERC standards that we've been talking about, right? Now, any of the utilities, for example, Southern California Edison, PG&E, San Diego, the larger utilities that are part of the ISO's balancing area, then yes, they are required to purchase all of their energy through the ISO markets, because otherwise we as the balancing area can't execute our obligations for reliability. So similar to any other balancing area, whether a generator is owned by the utility or maybe it's an independent power producer, they all must schedule or must move that energy through the balancing area operator in order for them to execute those reliability standards. So it is true that they have to do it. Now, back to your question, Tom, I think what we can explore, and we'll find out exactly how, Palo Verde has been participating in the EIM, but I think we can imagine as a nuclear power plant, it's not going to want to participate in an economic market by submitting supply bids and prices, right? So the question is, and really this, let's go back to Heidi's slide here. You notice that first area is talking about base schedules. Coming into the EIM, every balancing area is required to tell us what is the set of resources they're going to use to match their load. That's the base schedule. So I would imagine what we'll see like a nuclear facility is it's going to be running as a base load facility. It will be maximizing its output, but we might very well see every other generator in that balancing area, if it's APS we're talking about, every other generator then is bidding into the EIM, is providing supply bids. So quantities of megawatts with the price associated with that. And that's where they can show us they have enough resources to serve their load. That passes the resource test that's in EIM, but it also then provides an opportunity to economically optimize, and that's what the EIM will do for them. Is that helpful, Tom? Is that where you're going?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I guess, is it safe to say then all renewables which are intermittent would be kind of ideal inside the EIM then, because you've got to, if the cloud comes over and solar goes down, you got to be ready. You have to have that information immediately. Or...
Well, let me ask you, Holly, are you going to talk at all about renewables later on, how intermittent resources are handled? Are you going to get into that?
Not into that kind of
Okay.
detail.
So I'll try to be a little bit humorous here and just say any of us that are balancing our operators have a challenge with intermittent resources. And we keep adding more and more. That's where we're going across the Western interconnection. So in terms of these markets, we have different ways of dealing with that. For the most part, renewables end up maybe having prices associated with their output, but they tend to be resolved in the real-time market because, of course, it's very difficult to project what they would do in the day ahead. So we can talk some more maybe offline about how intermittent resources are dealt with in the markets. But the reality of it is, yeah, this is the reason why I like to say the key single word to any new resources is they have to be flexible, because we're talking about trying to operate a balancing area around a fair amount of intermittent resources that are moving around. And more so is the load. So those are our challenges, and that's where these 5-minute markets can help do that. Hope that helps.
Yes, go ahead. Yep.
Getting back to the base schedules and the bids a little bit, I'm wondering, is WEIM, are you matching buyers and sellers? And along with that, are you providing like best execution like a securities clearinghouse might? Or is it more like buyers are looking at a menu of available resources and then choosing themselves?
No, what they're doing is they're putting in for those base schedules, like Phil was just talking about, they're putting in a resource plan. So with their base schedules, they're doing that today with, even outside of the WEIM, they're looking at, because they have to provide this information to NERC saying, I can balance within my own area. Based on the load forecast, I have this, this fleet. And then they choose to put in their bids on that. When the market optimization happens, it's just looking at everything. So, they're the folks that have the supply, they're just saying, I have this, I'm going to choose to put these resources in here. And then all that data is the inputs that go into the market. And the load is just saying, I need this much. And part of the optimization is looking at what is the area that needs to be served at. So yeah, there's not a menu going, I really like that one. It's looking at everything.
So WEIM is actually allocating that supply then, and then the takers of the supply are sort of agnostic as to where it's coming from.
Right.
Okay.
And there are some things that they can do as far as, let's say you've got the different states, when they're putting in their bids, they can make the choice of whether or not they're going to supply it to serve California load or not. So, through their bids, they can go, I don't want to serve California load because there are some, carbon issues with the pricing for GHG, the greenhouse gases. And so that adds another layer, in the bidding settlements, et cetera. But they can make a designation of that. But as far as the load, they can't go, hey, I want it to only come from here. So it's just looking at, what those resources are. Yeah, sure. Thanks. Question. Anyone else? All right. So again, with those bids, those base schedules, they're putting those in, and these go in for each, any participant in the WEIM, they're putting those in to provide those hourly load forecasts. So they're looking at what were my forecasts, what do I need to supply for my own area for those non-participating resources, but also, what are the bids and base schedules for the participating resources as well. So we're going to be doing evaluations on these, saying, okay, what does that look like? What is that whole portfolio for, again, the forecast generation and interchange schedules? And then this is going to be used as the financial baseline for both participating and non-participating. So when we're doing these evaluations based on and we'll talk about evaluations here in a couple of slides, nothing is being committed here. We're really just looking to make sure it's like, are you leaning on your neighbors? Because we don't want any area to come in already short of energy or capacity that could cause a problem to their neighbors. The WEIM is very interconnected. And so, if there's bad behavior here can cause a problem in a different area. So that's why we really are big on communicating and making sure that, there's these tests to make sure everybody's coming in whole. And, we keep impressing that on everybody. It's like, so you're not leaning on your neighbors for that energy coming in. So we do that to make sure. And then also, again, the bids, that's part of the resource plan, is indicators of this is how much I'm willing to sell off, how many megawatts I'm going to put in to the market. And that's, again, for the participating resources. So that all gets looked at. When we get to processes, we'll talk about how that gets processed. We also have load forecasts. So I've mentioned that a couple of times. Those are what help the entities, determine what they're going to need to serve their own load, as well as what they can, then look at based on their resources, what can they actually sell off. So that's that supply that they're going to need. And the load forecast, there are a lot of different pieces of information. So it's not just weather, it's also historical data. Used to be, when Christmas lights, when that would come, when that come on, all of a sudden the demand for that time of year would be a lot higher. So that's a factor in there, as well as weather. So there's a lot of different things that are being looked at. One of the departments that we have in our organization is our short-term unit, our short-term forecasting group that's actually looking, they've got meteorologists, they're looking at the different weather. And the different entities can just determine, do they want to use the ISO's forecast that we're providing? And there is a cost associated with that, for the use of that, or they can supply their own. The benefit to using the ISO forecast is when we start talking about settlements. If you're using the ISOs, there's some flexibility from a settlements perspective if you're off. If your base schedule is coming in and it's not quite aligned with the ISO's forecast, there can be settlement implications. So I believe everyone that we have that's in the WEM right now is actually using the ISO's forecast. And we also, part of that is the modeling that we'll talk about as far as one of the inputs. We look at all the different resources that are a part of that, as well as weather, historical, et cetera. So we do have that as something that can be used. So critical data, that's very important to the optimization. So we look at all of the characteristics of the resources. And part of that is looking at when they're coming into the WEIM, or if they're adding a resource, if they're changing a resource, we have a database called master file. And so it's just like you said, it's just a database, but it has all of the characteristics that that are part of a resource. So if it's if it's hydro, how fast can it be flowing? What are the different business requirements? Maybe it has some other they've got some other regulations that are part of the Fish and Game. So it'll have that information. What type of a plant is it? Is it gas? Is it hydro? Is it cogeneration, different kinds, solar, et cetera. So we're looking at all of that. One of the things you see up here, PMIN and PMAX, that means physical minimum and physical maximum. So we're looking at what can those resources supply? What's that range? How low can it run at and safely run? How high can it run at and safely run? So what is that range? So it's all these different, the business information. It's also got the operational data. What can it provide? Some of the resources, you don't want to keep starting it up, shutting it down, because that can wear on the equipment that's out there. Some of the equipment that's out there providing the energy is pretty old, so you don't want to be turning it on, turning it off, and causing more issues. So it might be limited to how many times a day it can be started up. So all of this information is put in there. If it's variable energy resources, Phil was just talking about it, that has an indicator in there as well. And so some of that data. So the master file, it's a static, it's a static database. It's only as good as the information that goes in there. So, good data in, good data out. But that is something that feeds into the different applications. And when the market is optimizing, it's looking at all of these critical details to make sure that it's looking at what is the most efficient resource. We have that, and then we also have the full network model. So that was the characteristics about the different equipment, but then we have the full network model. That's the transmission system. How is this energy going to flow? How are we going to take the energy from these generating resources and actually get it to where it needs to go? So we have a model that we have, and we have a picture that we were going to show, and we're like, no, let's just not, because it gets a little confusing, overwhelming. And so we're like, let's just keep it on a simple, but it does support, like it says there, the day ahead and real-time markets, because we're looking at all of the different resources that are part of the high voltage grid, and we're looking at what is it going to take? What are the capabilities of getting the energy to where it needs to go? So that full network model, we have frequent updates that occur anytime there's a change to resources, maybe something's added, no longer available. We do those, and I believe we do it every 2 months now. I think it used to be quarterly. We're doing them more often at this point. But this is a very important piece that feeds into the data that goes into the optimization. We also have outages. What is, if there's a resource that's not available, maybe you bid it in, maybe it was bid in the day ahead and it was awarded, but now it's suddenly not available. Or if there's a resource that, maybe it was what we call derated, where it, usually can provide 10 megawatts, but it's part of it's being under, part of it is shut down for maintenance. It can only provide 5 megawatts. That could be an outage as well, but it's looking at what are the resources able to do right now. And we have systems where the different generators can put that information in there to let us know, to let the market know, what is the true capability. So these are all pieces of data that are inputs that are used in the process. So any questions about inputs before we get into the process? Actually, any questions before we take a break? See, I should never say that, because when you say any questions before you take a break, everybody's like, no, because you're all looking at each other like, you ask a question, you're in trouble. So if you think of any questions during the break, we'll, go ahead and, you can either come up and ask, or we can address those. I don't have the agenda. I think 15 minutes. Okay, so let's come back at 10:25. I just feel bad. There were a lot of good conversations going on there, and it's like, oh, interrupt the fun to come back to this. So. All right. So we've been talking about the inputs that go into our process now, or into our real-time market. Now we're going to start talking about the processes. What do we do with that information? We're going to keep this at a pretty high level. We're not going to go into the details of the different processes that are going on, but just kind of give you an idea of what is it that's happening for each hour to make sure that we get the best optimization. So we've got some timelines. I mentioned those before, but it really is important to be thinking about the timelines that the things are happening in, especially for the resources. They, the marketers, the people that are putting in the bids, the people that are putting in the base schedules, the ones submitting that data, and when things are happening, the timing is very important because there's not a lot of time to make adjustments, especially when we're in real time. So 75 minutes before each hour, that's when those resource plans, the bids and base schedules, those are when those are due. And each organization is putting those in. And so they're submitting, again, the base schedules for their non-participating resources and their base schedules for their participating resources, as well as bids, those financial or self-scheduled bids. So they put that information no later than 75 minutes before. They can be putting those in a little earlier. But then we have what we call resource sufficiency evaluations. So each operating hour, there are three, let's call it the bite at the apple. There are 3 different sets of evaluations that are being run. We'll talk about what those tests are that are part of the resource sufficiency. But it's to make sure that we're truing up, again, to make sure that the different balancing authority areas are not coming in leaning on their neighbors. So we're doing that. Again, nothing is financially committed at this time. It's 75 minutes before we do an evaluation. That's when that kicks that off. About 3 minutes after that, we have the results that come out. And it lets everyone know, did you pass or fail in the different tests that we'll talk about. And then if they failed in a particular area, they can make adjustments. They've got about 10 minutes to make any kind of adjustments before 55 minutes before the next operating hour to run another test. Now that load forecast that we talked about, that's a moving target between the T-75 and T-55. So they are looking at that. Maybe the load forecast changed. The variable energy resources, maybe that cloud cover did come in and that's going to make an adjustment. Maybe a resource is no longer available. Maybe they had to pick a different resource to be able to meet those requirements for that hour. So they can make those adjustments, put that back in, and then at 55 minutes before that operating hour, we run another set of these evaluations. And about 3 minutes after that, we get the results again. Did they pass or fail? If they failed any part of that, they still have one more opportunity to make any kind of adjustments. But the load forecast doesn't change, it locks in, because otherwise you could be chasing that all through the hour. So again, nothing is committed as part of that. It's just a test to make sure that the systems are coming in whole, the areas are coming in whole, that they have sufficient resources to match the bids that they put in. So we call that the resource sufficiency evaluations. Yes. Oh, thank you.
I'm curious about this resource sufficiency stage. Do the entities, do they give you the details of how they plan to run their non-participating units as well as their participating units?
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Do they in their do they give you details of how they plan to run their non-EIM participating units as well as their participating?
Yep, that's all factored in because when we're looking at the non-participating, it's what they're doing today, again, for NERC saying, yep, I'm good, I can balance my area, but this is letting us know that it's like, you're not going to come in and have a negative impact on the rest of the entities that you're connected with. So does that help? Thanks. Good question. So 40 minutes before the operating hour, that's when the last results come out. So that's letting them know if there is a failure, if they're passed. Most of them, because they've had that information up front, they know what their resources are, and the operators, the ones that we're talking about that are in the control room for the different resources, they can make those adjustments. That's where those operator inputs come in, where they might have to choose a different resource to be able to pass those tests. They're making some of those adjustments as well. At that 40 minutes before the operating hour, that's when those settlements, when we talk about our settlements a little bit later, that's setting a baseline for what their financial settlements are going to be. And that is for the non-participating as well. Are there any variances from, from what they were supposed to supply in their area as well? So we're looking at that, but that's where the financial baseline is. So when meter data comes back, then we're able to measure that from a settlement standpoint. But these are tests that are being done each hour before that market optimization starts. So this is with the exception of one piece that has to do with the balancing. There's no financial impacts on this. It's really just setting that baseline. But 37.5 minutes before the operating hour, that's when those market instructions start coming out. That's when they're starting to get those 15-minute instructions saying, I need your resource to be heading in that direction. They're getting those for the 7 15-minute intervals out, so they can it's a forward looking, it's giving them an idea of where do these resources need to be in these different intervals, so that the operators can take a look, make any adjustments that they might need to based on what that resource mix is looking like. So that's when the market optimization starts. Now we start to get into the financial, those instructions, these are awards that they're getting, say, start moving your resources there. So that's when we start the market optimization. And then we go down to the day ahead, or not day ahead, sorry, the real-time dispatch, which is every 5 minutes. But we're starting that with the 37.5 minutes before for the 15-minute, and then 7.5 minutes before each 5-minute interval, there's another optimization. So again, it's going to be looking at, 37.5 minutes, you're going to get those instructions, but it's going to be taking into account, did something change? With all that full network model, we have a state estimator. It's letting us know what's the state of the grid right now. And so that might have a change that's being made because now we have congestion in the area. We might have resources that are no longer available. It's what the operators are monitoring. So they might need to make those adjustments. So the dispatches, that's why we get the optimization again for the 5-minute. It's just fine tuning, and that's where the actual flowing of the energy is going to come in. So again, we've got the 15-minute market resource instructions, and then those 5-minute market resource dispatches. So again, the real important thing about there, not just the timing, but instructions versus dispatches. And we do have some resources that actually are a little further looking out. So we've got a 4-hour look ahead for our short start units that can be started out. So they're also, this is when we're looking at, do we need to have any, resources that we might need in 4 hours? We're kind of looking ahead at those as well. All right, we just talked about the resource efficiency evaluations. And again, those are to assess, make sure that there are no negative impacts in the operating hour by one of the balancing authority areas. So each BAA is doing this. They're looking at, they're supplying this information, and then we're running a test based, at this point, we're just looking at the areas by area. So this is not a grid-wide test that's going on. It's, are you good in your area? So there are 4 tests that are being run as part of the resource sufficiency evaluation. So the first one's balancing. So you remember earlier we talked about balancing. That's really a critical component. Can we balance that load forecast, that demand against the supply? And this is where, again, we're making sure that can you balance your own area in that next coming operating hour. So that's what we're assessing. That's where that forecast, when they can choose to use ours or theirs, it's better to use ours because if they're within 1% of what the forecast is, then they pass and there are no financial settlement implications. But if they're outside of that, if they use their own, we assess to see if they're within 5% range. So there's different ranges that we look at. but that's part of the balancing. There's also bid range capacity. So we've mentioned that for the participating resources, they can put in their bids, but then this is going to take a look at, can they actually meet that? Based on the supply plans that they're putting in there, with those bids, are they actually able to be moved up to that level or down? Can they be backed down from their use? And so it's got to be within that range, because they can't double bid on something that they're already using for maybe their capacity, you know. So there's calculations that are going on to say, can you actually, you know, supply what you're, you know, what you're offering? So that's a range that we take a look at, and they could pass or fail that section. So each one of these tests, they could pass or fail, but we still do look at them. You know, they're all run at the same time. We also have what we call flexible ramp. And we talked about a little bit earlier about the resources, how some of them take a little longer to be able to produce the energy that they're going to need to produce. So when they get those instructions, can they ramp up or ramp down to the level that they need to for the entire hour? So we assess, you know, where they can go for each 15 minutes. So for the first 15 minutes of the hour, next one, next one, next one. We assess for each one of those to kind of look at, based on the slope of the resources that are projected, can they meet that slope? Can all their resources for participating meet that slope in order to produce, supply that energy? So that's looking at those projected load curves, and that's taken a look at for that entire hour for each 15-minute. And then there's the feasibility. So feasibility is, can it actually flow on the transmission lines? Are there any issues that are going to cause any kind of overload based on maybe where the resources are located, based on the availability of the transmission? So that's looking at for the entire hour as well. So we run these tests just to make sure that that they can pass. But again, the only one that may have financial implications at this point is the balancing one, if they're outside of that forecast range. The others can, especially the bid range capacity and the flexible ramp, that can have an impact on the energy that flows between the different balancing authority areas. So earlier we talked about those interties, where they're flowing, and there are schedules about, if they can export or import. If they fail one of these tests, it may limit their capacity or their capability of importing that energy, or to the level they might want or need, or exporting it. So that's where it can have an implication for a particular 15-minute interval, where maybe they're not going to be able to export or input the energy to the level that they want. So that's why it's really important to be able to pass those tests as well, so that it doesn't have an impact on how the energy flows between the different balancing authority areas.
I have a question. In relation to the balancing, my understanding is that in order to participate, you have to be balanced, which is the balancing test. And so is that in relation to putting energy into the market or getting energy out of the market, or both?
It has to do with, are you meeting that load forecast? So it's a supply and demand. So it's looking at, can you do that within your own area, regardless of the different balancing authority areas? Can you supply for all your needs, all that demand that has been projected, that's been forecasted? Do you have the resources that are available to actually supply for that? Is that what you're asking, or did I might have gotten your question a little wrong? So.
Sorry, I guess I'm just trying to understand if you're looking to purchase in the market, but you're not, in order to meet your load demand in your area, but you're not balanced. To meet your load, that means you're not balanced, correct? And so how do you participate in that situation? I mean, when would you be? I'm trying to understand if you need load and you need to purchase load in the market, but you have to be balanced. It means that you're not balanced, right?
Well, you're purchasing for the load. So, that's what is needed to keep the lights on. And so then you're saying, all right, I need to go out and get that supply to keep that balance. And if there's not enough, if they come in and they can't do that within their own area, that's where they might need to look at, other locations. They might need to import that. And that's where the planning outside of the market would happen. They would have to go and say, where do I have contracts that I can pull from? Are there any kind of, power pools, that they might be part of? So they're going to have to figure out where they can get that energy to fulfill their needs within their own area. So there are other places that they might need to go have it. That's still going to need to be put in to their bids and base schedule. So they would need to account for that, so that when we're making these assessments, we're going, okay, now maybe you brought in maybe you're short 10 megawatts and you were able to go out to your neighbor and say, do you have some energy that I can purchase outside of the market? And they can do that through the scheduling. And then that would they could demonstrate that by putting it in, either we have a tool that is called BSAP, which is our bid base schedule. Thank you. Base schedule aggregation portal, where they can put in those base schedules, or if it's within a shorter window and they don't have time to put it in BSAP, the operator could then make an adjustment, what we call an imbalance conformance, to say, hey, I was able to get this, and they make adjustments based on those resources to show, yep, we've got it. So does that help? Or, all right, great. Thank you. Good question. Yes.
Hey, Heidi, I do want to I want to add a little bit to the answer, right? Because there's an important principle here in EIM, and you'll hear when Milos and I talk about the EDAM as well. The balancing areas are required to come into this market fully balanced. So your premise that somebody could be short coming in, that's not acceptable. It really is using this market to help them resolve things like imbalances that Heidi's been talking about. So as Heidi mentioned, though, they don't really have an ability to run that resource sufficiency test on their own ahead of time. It's really subject to their balancing area practices and processes to be able to prove by inputting into our tools that they had enough. And then there's bands, that 1% or 5% that gives them some leeway, should we say. But the reality of it is, the principle is to come into the market fully resourced, and then allow the market to deal with the variations in load or the variations in the resources, in particular, like the intermittent resources. Allow the market to help them resolve those things in real time, but they're expected to come in without being deficient.
And we had a question right here.
Well, I think that answered my question generally, because it's kind of a conundrum to see that evaluation, but to see imbalance is in the title of the market, right? So trying to understand where the rubber really meets the road on that evaluation.
Yeah.
So it's just something to
Yeah,
to-
and
to
it gets
try to
confusing
understand.
because it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, you got the market that's optimizing, and it does get really confused with the evaluation, where it really is just an evaluation, like, are you whole? Like Phil was saying, are you coming in where you've got, you're not going to have any negative impacts. You're balancing your own area so that you've like he said, you're not going to be able to participate in the market if you're not whole, and that's where the limitations start coming in, where you might be limited down to the value that you show you can prove, so you might still be in the market, but you're not, what's being optimized, but you're not going to be able to be fully optimized to the level that you might need to supply that energy in your own area.
And are there participants that don't have to meet these standards, like marketers that are like hedging? And I mean, isn't it even more complicated?
Convergence bidding, is that what you're, there are the marketers, that's gonna be talked about day ahead, but yeah, maybe.
No, again, the participants we're talking about here in the EIM are balancing areas. They are system operators, and they're responsible for balancing their portion of the grid. I think to your question, Tom, when we talk about, or when we use the term imbalance, and we're going back to some of that operator jargon, I think is the best way to think about it. You raised a good clarification in a temporal aspect. Can you be imbalanced, 1 hour, 1 day, a week, a month in advance? I guess all of us might say, well, yeah, I guess you could. But in the context of what we're talking about, imbalances occur in real-time operations. That's why I was trying to create a little bit of a black and white picture that coming into the market, everybody is balanced. Everybody has enough resources to meet their load. What we're dealing with is those things like load forecasts that can change. And I think we all know load forecasts are almost always wrong in some form or another. And what we're trying to do is then create the balance within the real-time operations.
So how often do you run this evaluation on balancing?
Every hour. And we run it for each balancing authority area, and we run this 3 times for each operating hour. So there's, that's where that 75 minutes before the operating hour, 55 minutes, and then 40. And then that's where they have that opportunity to fine tune it. And we kind of use the example of, it's kind of like showing up at a potluck. We're just making sure that, somebody doesn't show up going, I didn't bring anything and everybody else brought all the food. It's like, you got to make sure that everybody's pulling their fair share.
And so after the fact, each BA knows hour by hour when they failed that test?
Yes.
For the year, they know that.
They're going to know it in real time. So I mentioned that base schedule aggregation portal, they will see results in that as to whether or not they passed or failed. And they get to see where they passed or failed. For the balancing and feasibility, they'll know if they passed or failed for the full hour. And if they fail it T-minus 75, at 75 minutes before the hour, they can make an adjustment. If they pass, they're still going to want to take a look at it at 55 minutes before, because again, that forecast can change. And, but if they pass at T-minus 55, call it T-minus 55 minutes before the hour, then they're like, okay, we're good. The operators are also looking at what we call BAOP, which is our Balancing Authority Area Operations Portal. And so they're being able to see this in real time as well. When these results come out, about 3 minutes after they're run, they're going to see they have different screens that show them, did you pass? And for, like, let's use bid range capacity. Again, do you have enough bids to go up? And do you have enough bids that we can back you down as well? They're going to be able to look and see, did you pass or fail for each 15-minute interval? And then which direction did you pass or fail? So that really this information is giving them a situational awareness tool where they can go, okay, I'm not passing this area. And then there's more data that they can dig into. If they're like, I didn't pass this, I can now go into some other screens that can say, where was the issue? Was it a particular resource? Was it an outage? Was it, was there, am I expecting it to do something, but the bids were not the right, were limited. They can look at it. Was it in the base schedule? What were the numbers that were put in there? They can go down and to that level and see, troubleshoot it so that they can go, all right, what do I need to do in order to make those adjustments? So they're getting this for each hour. They're getting it for each one of these. I think I died. Nope, there it is. It's back on. Thank you. I was like, I just had to hover my hand over it and it was like, it works again. So yeah, hopefully that helps, but there's a lot of data that's going out, and that's where the marketers, they're the ones that are putting in the bids based schedules. We can call marketers, traders, they're putting in that initial information, but it really is working together with the operators as well. And that's where you start to see that difference between, markets over here and reliability. You can start to see that by using the markets, by using this data, we're actually projecting what that reliability is going to look like going into that hour. And so again, that's where these are just those tests that are being run. So now, after that 40 minutes before the hour, now we can start the market and the optimization. That's where the market starts. So kind of going back to this slide right back here. So again, the resource sufficiency, those are the evaluations that, I don't know if this has a pointer. Well, it wouldn't. So this here, resource sufficiency evaluations, that's just, are you coming in not leaning on anyone? Now at 37 minutes before the hour, now we're going to start actually giving instructions, giving, dispatch instructions for the 5-minute. And now that's when we start getting into the settlement implications. So it's kind of confusing because, that's a lot of people come in, they're like, but you're telling me what I'm going to have to supply, 75 minutes before the hour. The optimization is going to make that decision as to which one of those resources in that area is most efficient, based on what's going on in the whole grid, what's the state of the system, what are the markets, what is the information that's been provided in these bids and base schedules. And, now it's looking again at all those other details that are part of the market optimization as to what's available, what's most cost effective, by location, what's there. Is it, one of the things that we've just added is demand response is now considered in these resource sufficiency, so that will be beneficial to the balancing authority areas where they can actually count that demand response that they're using, to hold behind in case they need it for this reliability in their own area. That can count toward this resource evaluation as well, so that, if it's not needed, it could be optimized as well. So, there's a lot of, that's continuing to evolve. We actually have a project right now that is continuing to reimagine the resource efficiency evaluations so that it's real clear on, going down to the level of what kind of capacity you have, what are diversity benefits. It's like, it's going down to all these different levels, all these calculations to figure out, what's going to be best for that, to supply the needs in your own area without having a negative impact. So, yes. Can I get you to use your mic so I can hear? Sorry.
I hope this is better. Okay. If I'm purchasing, let's say, okay, first, if I am a different balancing area other than the ISO, can I purchase energy in the day ahead in real time? And if so, do I need to meet those 4 tests to purchase energy?
Right now with the WEIM, it's real time only. And so you'd be purchasing that, you'd be submitting that in the real time. So right now you'd not be participating in the day ahead. But that's what, Phil and Milos are going to be talking about a little bit later, is that extended day ahead market where we're extending that out to these areas so that they can start realizing the benefits. They'll talk about it later, but as that's one of the things that's still being discussed in EDAM is, what is this going to look like? Are they going to need these kind of resources? Because like the ISO, we, fully participate in the day ahead in real time. And so anyone that's participating in the day ahead, that's really acting as our resource sufficiency, because we're kind of going, all right, what is it going to take to supply the, for the demand in our area? And so it's kind of locking it in a day in advance. We've got different processes that Rod is going to talk about to true that up, to make sure that not only do we have sufficient financial, in the day ahead, but also do we have the resources to show up a day in advance? So that's going to be, if you're participating in the extended day ahead market, that's kind of showing a day in advance that you're satisfying this. But as a WEIM entity right now, each one of them is responsible for submitting this information and passing these evaluations. Right, thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh,
if I can just add to that, and I don't know if this was, your question was getting to this, but also if you're an EIM entity, you can procure in the bilateral market the day before or even ahead to pass the EIM resource sufficiency evaluation. And I think, Heidi, you were going to get to this as well. Just circling back on an earlier question, the resource sufficiency evaluation does provide useful information as to whether you're coming in sufficient, whether you're meeting your obligations. But it's also important to recognize that if you ultimately don't pass that sufficiency evaluation, there are certain consequences that flow in the market, such as limiting transfers. And I think Heidi's going to touch on that as well. So there is a purpose to this resource sufficiency evaluation beyond just demonstrating and informationally knowing whether you have sufficient resources. There are certain consequences that flow if you don't pass that sufficiency evaluation.
right. And that consequence is, like you just mentioned, that if they're, it could lock your energy transfers between the different areas. So maybe you need 100 megawatts to come from your neighbor. And because you didn't pass the test, but in the last hour, you were only getting 50 megawatts. It's going to lock it at that last successfully passed interval. And that's what the value is going to be. So that's where a consequence might be, is that, you can't, maybe if you were going to import that energy, you couldn't import to the level that you need to, so. You have a question back here.
Well, I was just going, as I guess sort of a comment. I mean, isn't it the case that, and maybe some of the disconnect here is that you might come into the market, you're balanced in the sense that you have resources you could dispatch in order to meet your obligations, but you might prefer market energy from an economic standpoint, right? Isn't that the whole idea?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So there, because it's, when we get into market optimization, it's like, you can maybe have that, you got your resource pool within your own area. But yeah, if you're participating in the market, now when it's doing the optimization, it's going to end up with a real-time price, the energy price. And Rod is going to talk about the LMP, the locational marginal pricing. Your resource might cost $50 to run. And with the reoptimization, you might get a resource where the energy price is $15, so so that's where you're starting to realize some of those benefits based on the most cost effective. Good question. Any other questions? So these are the processes, and if you think about any other follow-up questions on these, we can go back through them. Kind of keeping them at a higher level, because it can get, we could go through it for a long time. We go through what the calculations mean and what those consequences could be. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ask, but that's those from the high level. And so then we're going to go to outputs. So what do those outputs look like? We've been talking about, the resources, the information that's going in there, our evaluations, our optimizations, and then what are those outputs? Now, we already mentioned that the outputs from a real-time standpoint are going to be the 15-minute instructions for the 15-minute market and the 5-minute dispatches for the real-time dispatch. But it also comes out in settlements. So again, all of those different awards that come out in the 15-minute, there's going to be a settlement for each one of those each one of those awards. It's going to have that for the day ahead, for anybody that's participating in the day ahead. But for real time, it's going to have it for real time price as well as 15-minute instructions. So we're going to take a look at what is that meter data. Like I said before, with those evaluations, that's kind of setting our financial baseline. And based on that, so it's like, these are the numbers that came in, that you're going to be serving your load, that you're participating in. And now we're going to look at, after the fact, what actually flowed, what actually happened in the meter. And then there's going to be a true up between that. So those are all inputs that are going into our settlement system. The real-time data for 15-minute, 5-minute. If you didn't pass the balancing, that could be an input into there as well. And then we have lots of calculations, formulas, and settlement rules. And I'll spare you from any of those details because, you know, the first time I looked at one of our, we have business practice manuals, and you open it up and there's a lot of characters, calculations, formulas. It could be quite overwhelming. But the reason it goes down into that level is because a lot of our customers want that granularity so that when you go back to start, you know, trying to justify maybe the prices that you're putting onto your customers, you're able to go and justify where that, you know, where those costs are coming from. But there are several, you know, calculations, formulas, those go into our settlement rules, and those result in our settlement statements. Yes.
Sorry, when you talk about your customers, so are your customers the balancing authorities or operators?
That would be, when I'm talking about that, the customers. So, you know, we're going to settle these for the balancing authority areas. So they're going to receive these settlement statements, you know, invoices or payment advices. What do you have to pay, or what are you going to be receiving? But a lot of them, a lot of the different balancing authority areas, they might have to justify those costs that they're passing on to their customers. So, you know, whatever their, you know, their customer mix would look like, you know, they might have to justify that by going into some of that detail. So does that help? So these settlement statements, again, we've got the settlement statements that are coming out, and on these, each transaction is settled out. So you're going to be able to see each one of those listed. And then weekly, there are invoices that are being, that need to be paid. So on a weekly basis, we're, they need to be paid on, you know, they get those invoices. They need to pay those by 10 o'clock in the morning on a weekday, on Wednesdays, so on Tuesdays, sorry, Tuesdays, so that we can turn around and pay those prices out for the payment advices. Anyone that deserves that, we turn around and pay that out by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's why it's really important that we get the payments in, because we don't have just, you know, like, hey, we can just hang out with all this money, you know, and we've got to go through and account for everything, and we need to get that money out as quickly as possible. Now, there's a settlement process, so if, you know, maybe somebody doesn't agree with what the meter said, there's discrepancies. We have a dispute process as well, and so there is a process that our settlements go through, and it can take up to 24 months to make a final settlement, because the different resources could have an impact on the prices. Yes.
Thanks. What has been your experience year to date, 2022, on an average Tuesday?
Oh,
Money, how much you pay out?
you know what? I would have to, oh, is Amelia? Amelia maybe would be able to, would you have any, Amelia's with our Department of Market Monitoring. They have a lot of different reports. I don't know if you would have that answer. Like,
I think the question is what is an average Tuesday?
for
Look
yeah,
like?
Correct,
I don't
correct.
know if you have
In the
reports
most
like-
recent calendar year.
It depends on which seat you're sitting in. I have a slide that I put into the presentation for tomorrow, and I think those are shared, that show what the average 15-minute market prices were across the year of I think that one is from 2020, but I have the 2021 as well. And it's different in different areas depending on where you are, what the greenhouse gas compliance obligation is in your area, and what the transmission constraints are that separate that area from the rest of the system.
Would it be easier to express it as a range?
Would it be easier to express it in a range? I'm not sure which state you're from, my memory's not that good, but I can look up and tell you exactly what it was for last year and the year before for the balancing areas in your state, if you'd like.
Thank you. Arizona, when you get time.
All right.
Great.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're here, Amelia. Thank you. Great question. So, And we, if you have any other questions about some of that data that, we do have a tool called Oasis that's got a lot of good information on there. So, if you have any of those other questions, we can definitely follow up and get the information that you're looking for. So. All right, so that's our settlements process. I'm going to keep it high level because it's getting close to lunch and I want to keep you guys awake. So settlements can get quite detailed as far as the different, calculations and how everything is settled out. But the most important thing about our settlements is that we need to account for everything that comes in. We do have our grid management charges that Rada's going to talk about that, cover our administrative expenses, the ISO's expenses, but everything else that comes in needs to be allocated back out. So it's, we don't just go, wow, we're going to have a nice big party because there's, a few $100 extra. So it's like everything that comes in is going to be accounted for. And we do have in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, there are allocations that we have, and it's based on the LMP, the locational marginal pricing that Rada's going to talk about, where we look at if there's congestion that's caused by a particular area. We'll look at, okay, that area might have to pay because they cause congestion, but how is that allocated back out to the other entities? So if you're, not going to take you through that kind of settlements, but if you're interested in more about the settlements, especially after Rada takes you through locational marginal pricing, we can definitely follow up and with more data about that. All right, so that's the high level of our outputs. Are there any questions that we have about the processes that we talked about? We talked about the inputs. So again, that data that's coming in, the resource characteristics, resource availability, different bilateral contracts, that information that might be put in that has an impact. Day ahead market, what were those results that are part of the inputs? And then we've got the processes, again, the evaluation. Are you coming in whole? Are you leaning on your neighbors? And then from there, we've got the optimization for every 15-minute and 5 minutes. So those are the processes that are being run. And then those result in outputs, again, of those instructions for every 15 minutes, and then 5-minute dispatches, and then ending up in our settlements. So that's our inputs through our outputs. Any questions about that before we move to the final slide that talks about kind of our stakeholder support? Any other questions? Oh. All right. Going backwards here. All right, so, oh yes, go ahead.
So we talked about generators bidding into the market, and I'm wondering, is there demand response bidding in?
Demand response is being factored into it's being factored in now into the resource sufficiency. So it's being accounted for there. So is that getting to the question? Or?
I'm more imagining it being bid into the EIM as a resource. Does that happen at the moment?
I think they'll indicate it in their base schedules. I believe that's how there's a process where they can, that they're going through where they submit, we have what we call a city process. And it's I always get the acronym wrong, customer inquiry and data information. I probably get the I's always confused. But there's a process that they can go through to identify what is demand response. And so this is just new, that's just coming out. It's a manual process right now. And then that has a determination of, how that's going to be, looked at in their evaluations. I'm not sure because we still have part of that process that is continuing to move forward in different phases. And so, on our website, there is the resource sufficiency evaluation, and it's a project that's going on. So if you're interested in more details about that as it continues to roll out, then that's a good place to check, because we're still tracking it as well as it's coming out and how that information is going to be used. And so, yeah, so
Thanks.
that's continuing to evolve.
Yeah, and this is Milos with the ISO. Like Heidi said, we've had some recent changes to the policy, but effectively demand response today in the EIM effectually reduces the amount of load it's a load modifier, so it reduces the amount of load that you have to demonstrate resources to meet the resource sufficiency obligation.
Okay, so it's seen as load rather than generation.
Right, but we're working on finding ways as well as including it as a resource that's biddable in the market. Just that there are so many different programs across the West. Some are more flexible than others, and so we're trying to find kind of the appropriate way of treating these different programs, and that's part of the policy design at this stage. But the recent design allows these to be load modifiers in that resource sufficiency, but reducing your load towards which you have to demonstrate resource sufficiency.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I do have another question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, we talked about sort of generators participating and bidding in to indicate that they want to participate on the day or in the hour.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering about the transmission side of things. When is it that the transmission sort of available capacity is handed over? And, you know,
Those are contractual. Go ahead, Phil, you. I was like, I saw Phil's look on his face and I'm like,
Well, this is fun. This is fun because Milos is going to spend a fair amount of time this afternoon talking about how we're going to deal with transmission in the extended day ahead market. But the answer in EIM is really quite simple. There is no compensation because when we're sitting here talking at the 1 hour before, the opportunity cost for transmission is essentially zero. So what all of the market participants and stakeholders decided when we were designing EIM is the balancing areas will make transmission available, but there isn't any compensation for that.
okay, so it's the hour before that it becomes available. And up until that point, they have the opportunity to sell it if there was a market there.
I'm sorry, could maybe
So
rephrase
if they
it?
wanted to sell some of their available transmission capacity, they would have up until an hour before, until they're really into the IM 75 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it's whatever they haven't otherwise committed through their oath, whatever their long-term transmission sales are, those would otherwise be committed. If there's anything that has not been sold, that's why I was characterizing it as essentially an opportunity cost it's zero. So this gives them an opportunity to put that into the market and potentially utilize it for accessing these lower cost resources. That's what EIM is doing in trying to solve the imbalance.
Okay, thanks.
all right. Any other questions?
Sure, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a good, I guess this one is kind of for Milos. So the EIM presently has a demand response component to it then if the BA submits reduced load, they tell you it's reduced because of demand response?
That's right. We implemented this recently, but there's certain requirements that have to be met, but they would demonstrate how much demand response they have that's readily available and that acts to reduce the amount of the load that has to be met.
I don't think Arizona's doing any of that, are they?
I'm not sure with Arizona. We can certainly look.
And you calculate a value of that then for that hour by each BA and they know?
Right. That's right. That's right. The utility, the load serving entity or the participating entity identifies that amount of demand response that can be made available or that stands ready. Yeah. Yeah, they provide the information.
Okay, so if we're looking at how to properly compensate retail customers for doing behaviors, we could have that, that data the BA has that could serve as a basis for compensation to retail customers?
If I understood you correctly, yes, each EDAM entity has their own processes for how they treat demand response, their own requirements, and they can identify an amount of demand response on an hourly basis that may be available as a load reduction.
Yeah.
And that affects their resource sufficiency.
Because we're working on a tariff in Arizona, and obviously how much you pay the retail customer has a lot to say with how much they're willing to do.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, trust me, when it's 118 degrees and
Yeah.
change your thermostat. Yeah.
Yeah. In California as well, we have different
Yeah.
demand response programs, some that are, can be called upon in regular conditions, others that can be called upon in emergency conditions as well. And that's something that we have an ongoing initiative, as Heidi mentioned, that's looking at some of these variations in demand response programs across the West, and identifying different opportunities for demand response programs to participate depending on that structure.
Now, is the EIM sort of well equipped to deal with, I guess what we're hearing is more emergencies, whether it's due to fire and transmission lines going down? I mean, is this, and then there's immediate imbalances, is this a feature the EIM is capable of dealing with, maybe more volatility than in the past?
Yeah. So something as well that we're looking through the initiative. Yeah. As the EIM, I think we started in 2014, and we've been kind of evolving it every year as we learn new information, new challenges that we face across the West. So one of the things that we're looking at currently, and I think a number of EIM entities have provided proposals on this that we're evaluating, but is in those emergency conditions, rather than potentially limiting transfers, if you're in an emergency condition and you can't potentially pass the resource sufficiency evaluation because you lost transmission facilities, you lost resources, how can you, through the EIM, not just be locked out of transfers and benefiting from market transfers in those conditions, but how can you unlock some of the benefit and still allow, if some of the balancing authority areas have surplus generation, how can you allow the BA that hasn't passed the resource sufficiency evaluation to still participate in the EIM for that hour and benefit from those transfers? And we're looking at potential policy enhancements that includes what's called hurdle rates, that in those emergency conditions, you can be okay with not passing the resource sufficiency evaluation, but I'm not going to lock you out of the market. I'm going to allow you still to access some of this supply, but at a potentially a higher cost because you're in an emergency condition, you didn't come prepared, or you didn't meet your obligation coming in. But yeah, we're looking actively at recognizing the challenges, the common challenges that we're starting to increasingly face. How do we ensure that the EIM can also be a solution in those tough emergency conditions?
Since you mentioned the emergency conditions, there are also there are operating procedures that we have where if there is an issue that a BAA is facing, they can actually choose to lock. Maybe they don't want any more imports coming in. They can choose to lock their energy transfers so that they're not getting overloaded. The only thing is that when they lock that, it locks everybody, so that's where you have everything tied together. But there are, ways that a market or a BAA can actually isolate themselves from the market if need be in some of those conditions. That's more if it's within their own area, that what Milos was talking about was, resolving those using the different entities, which can, definitely can be utilized, but there's also processes to protect, that they can use to protect their systems. It's great questions. Anyone else? All right. Actually, I'm glad that a couple of these questions did go to Milos, because this is my last slide, just a high level, but what are some of the things that the ISO offers, especially to our, to all of our customers, and all of our customers, in order to participate in the market, have to be a scheduling coordinator. So there's a certification process that they go through. Going through the WEIM, there's more of a lengthy process because you're being modeled in, et cetera. But we have a very robust stakeholder process, and especially for the WEIM, we have frequent meetings that we have with the operations to kind of troubleshoot, do some lessons learned with the operators to figure out how we have best practices. We have a lot of conversations, a good relationship in the WEIM community where they're sharing information and quarterly meetings so that they can propose different technologies, processes, tools, et cetera, that will really be of benefit. And like the resource sufficiency evaluation, that's one of our stakeholder processes, and it came about by the entities saying, that's good. Our resource efficiency evaluations have been evolving. We want to evolve it a little further and add demand response. So we have a lot of processes, stakeholder processes. You can follow those on our California ISO website. And it's under participate, I think. There's participate, stay informed. I think it's stay informed. But all of our stakeholder processes are located on there, and you can follow along on our calendar. There are meetings that you can participate in, listen into. We record those meetings so that they're available. We have a lot of training resources. So for myself, I work with the onboarding entities doing their foundational training for their operators settlements, going through the process. And I work with their trainers, the different areas trainers, to get them ready so that they can have repeatable training for their folks. So it's not just, hey, we're in there, we're going to get you live in WEIM, and then we're done. We're working on making sure that they have some stable trainers that if they get somebody new in there, they can have continuing education programs that they can feed into their NERC required training. So we have a lot of those resources. We provide a portal and it's secured for the WEIM entities so that we can share more specific information that is, that we don't want to have open to the whole world. Some information is fine, but other, like tools, technologies that we have, we want to keep those, more confidential. So we provide those kind of resources for them, and all of our training, we record it, we provide that so that they can build that into their own training. And then we also have our learning center, which is for more of our general training for all of our stakeholders that people can look at. So we have a lot of training information that we put out there. We have situational awareness tools. So a few minutes ago, I talked about what the operators can see, in context of the resource efficiency evaluation, so they can see what's passed or failed. But they have a real-time display that's saying what's happening right now. What is, what does my system look like right now? And then they can go and troubleshoot. They can dig in more. And a lot of there are several different displays in that tool for operators to use. And when they want something new, we poll the community, figure out what's most important, and then we develop what they need in order to, from a BayOps standpoint, they're able to start doing, putting in some of this demand response. They're being able to put in a bias for that, to put that information in. So there are things that they can do in these tools, but also just so that they can take a look at what's going on in the system, so they can determine how they can troubleshoot, and that's taking that information from master file and modeling that all in there from the full network model, from the outages, taking all of that information in there so that they really do have situational awareness, which is important, not just because it's a reliability issue and, it's the prudent thing to do. There are also NERC requirements around that situational awareness. So we help to encourage that as well. Have a robust market. We talked about the real time. Again, the WEIM is not a separate market. It's based on our real time market that we have now. And then Rod is going to talk about the day ahead. And then Phil and Milos, the extended that we're moving toward. Technical innovation, and I got innovative with my N apparently too. So, but we have a lot of technologies and tools that we're always creating. So those are available to, to the different entities. A lot of them use third-party vendors, third-party software, but we also provide those tools for submitting bids, for submitting base schedules, for, seeing the load forecast, for all type, for city, for settlements. We have settlement software that they can pull the invoices and the payment advices to see what's on their settlement statements. So we have a lot of different technologies that we're creating and constantly evolving, and it really has to do with our stakeholder process. We get a lot of feedback from our customers. And I should say, customers or stakeholders. And that's a wide variety because we deal with the government agencies, we deal with, the PUC, we deal with our generators, we deal with our marketers, legal, policy. So a wide variety of customers. We try to, make sure that we're engaged with all types of stakeholders. We have real-time best practices for our operators, as I mentioned, and operational guidance through some of those operating procedures. Like I said, with the operating procedure for making sure that the market is secure, for emergency situations. And we train on that with our different states. In fact, in our different balancing authority areas. In fact, we just started doing tabletops to actually be able to walk through some of these scenarios. What is that communication going to look like? And so that we make sure that we're making decisions that are going to keep the system whole, that are going to keep the lights on. So there's lots of opportunity for that communication. Our operators have what we call an Everbridge system that if something happens with the market, they can ship out an email that goes out to all the different operators that are on the real-time desks. So they're all getting that same situational awareness information so that they can make adjustments and protect their own system. So we have a lot of these different tools. There, our website, which is actually going through a redesign this year. So just about the time I've finally gotten where everything's at, they're going to move it around, and then I'm not going to know where everything's at anymore. But we have a lot of good information. Sometimes too much information, so if there's ever anything that you have questions about, please feel free to reach out. And this is my last slide. So I'm again from the customer readiness group. So if you have any questions, sometimes you ask a question, it's like, I don't know, we're going to have to follow up because there's a lot of data out there. Like I mentioned, we've got Oasis, which is an information tool that is open to anyone. And that provides a lot of good information about the energy flows, the different resource types, et cetera. On our website, I don't know, kind of raise a hand. How many people have ever looked at our Today's Outlook on the ISO website? So I see a couple of people, they're on there. That is a resource that's available. You can also download it to your phone. And it starts giving information about the resource mixes for supply, demand, some of those targets that we've hit, and it also has a price map that's on there, so that you can kind of get an idea of what was that when Rada talks about the LMP, it shows that information on there for the day ahead, for the hour, for real time, and for the 5 minutes. So you can look down at what was the energy clearing price, what was congestion doing, what are those prices in those different, based on those different optimizations in the different timing, what price is going to be associated with that. So that's a kind of an idea, people can look at and go, oh, prices are going to be high because, in this particular area, probably means that there's congestion, so. But so that's a good tool. We also like to plug this. We have a daily briefing. It's on our website. And it's under Stay Informed, and there's, I think it's notifications and subscriptions and notifications, but we have a daily briefing email that comes out every day, and it gives information about maybe meetings that are coming up. Maybe there's been a change to a settlements invoice or a policy that's going in, a project, a call for stakeholder input. These go out every day, and you just get one email instead of, getting a bunch of bombarded. It comes out about 1,300 every day. And it gives kind of a, the high level synopsis of what's important coming up in this, this next week, in the next couple of days. So I highly encourage people to sign up for that, because that kind of gives you an idea where you can look through it and go, nothing applies to me, delete. Or, hey, that's something I want to research more, and it'll usually provide a link to get you more information. So with that, I'm talked about kind of some of the things that we offer. Any questions that I can answer about anything that we've talked about today, about any of the resources that we have available to our customers, or? Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to circle back to the question that came earlier about the Palo Verde nuclear facility. I did get some information on that I wanted to share. So specific details about the Palo Verde facility are confidential, but what I can share about that facility is that there are actually multiple parties, both within the WEIM and the ISO, that have rights to share percentages of that unit's output. And each of those parties has their own ability to model that resource as either a participating resource or a non-participating resource for their particular share of how that works.
Thank you, Rada. And actually, that brings up a good point too. We just had a process project that went through when we had Tucson that just joined EIM. They actually have what we call a joint owned utility. So that's been something that's changed in this last year where it's like, yeah, you've got two different balancing authority areas who have that jurisdiction. And that just went through as to how can you bid on the different parts of that? How do you base schedule it? So that's one of those examples of an evolution with what are some of these complicated resources that there are, different parties that are part of. So yeah, that continues to evolve based on stakeholder input, stakeholder needs, and the more we learn, the more the resources come in, the more things change. So thanks, Rada. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you. But thank you all very much. I really appreciate this, appreciate your questions. And if you have any questions, you can email customer readiness. You can ask Phil, you can ask Milos, or you can ask any of us from the customer readiness group back there. So, all right, thank you.